All right, Zach, welcome to the Man Talk Show. How are you doing today?
Glad to be with you, Connor. Looking forward to being with the audience as well.
Yeah, likewise. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Do you prefer, I didn't ask you this before we jumped on, but do you prefer Dr. Bush? Do you prefer Zach? Is it?
Zach's good.
I just didn't want to, and you never know. I've had some philosophers and astrophysicists on the show, and it's like, it's doctor, right? So it's like, I'm just making sure, covering my grounds. Well, wonderful. Well, I did a tremendous amount of research leading up into this and listened to a bunch of shows that you've been on. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I think I recently just had a child, and I was watching your. He's actually 8 weeks old, I think, yesterday. And
the milk dragon.
What's that?
The milk dragon.
Oh, you saw that? My little milk dragon. Yeah. Yeah, my little milk dragon. Yeah. Yeah, so good. But I was watching one of your after school specials, and it was really talking about the impact of I think it was Roundup and some of the chemicals that were in there. And so as I researched how to approach this conversation, I was like, man, there's so many different things I want to talk to you about. I feel like you're one of those guests that I really would love to dive into multiple topics for like 3 hours. But obviously that poses some challenges. So I think where I want to begin is just with a broad question that we can then narrow down from. And the question is, where are we right now as a species, as a collective, in your eyes, based on your work in your field? And I think just to sort of frame this, like, how would you describe to your grandchild, let's just say in 50 years from now, what we are facing in our culture, in our society, in our health systems, and what we're dealing with right now? And maybe we'll just start there and sort of see where that takes us.
Yeah, I'm joining you from my clinic in Virginia. I'm an internal medicine doctor, subsequently endocrinology and metabolism specialty, and then hospice and palliative care were kind of the trajectory of my career, and started my medical school training in 1992. And so, unbeknownst to me at that time, I would be witness to the biggest, transformation of human health in the history of mankind. And so bridging that from 1992 to 2022 here, as we approach the end of this year, that interesting 30-year period has really encapsulated, this explosion of chronic disease on the planet. And when I say planet, it really goes beyond the human experience, right? We're watching somewhere between 1,000 to 10,000 time acceleration of extinction rates of species on the planet over that 30-year period. 1,000 is the most conservative. Most scientists are in the 5,000 to 10,000 range of estimates at the speed of extinction now of species. And so we're in the midst of this sixth great extinction that began sometime in the 60s, 1960s, 1970s, somewhere in there is where things started to pick up a little bit of steam. And then we went into the kind of the logarithmic stuff right towards the end of the last century, 1998 to 2004. That 6-year period was just explosive with everything from neurodegenerative conditions and neurologic dysfunction in children. It was autism spectrum disorder exploded, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, sleep disorders, collapse of sexual sex drive, sexual function, and then screw up in puberty in that time as well. And so we see fertility starting to be, compromised even before the fertile years. And so a lot of children presenting with precocious puberty, especially young girls. By the time we were hitting like 2005, we had 1 in 4 girls in America with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is an irregular menses prone to poor fertility. And over the same period of time, we saw sperm counts go from around 100 million per milliliter of sperm down to about 47, 49 milliliters or million sperm per milliliter. And that, halving of the mammalian sperm count, or at least the human sperm count, happened across all Western nations. So it wasn't a U.S. problem. That was Europe, Australia, anybody who had adopted a Western civ kind of lifestyle, of food system, pharmaceutical system, had seen this collapse in fertility. We now have 1 in 3 males in the United States with sperm counts too low to reproduce. And so with 1 in 3 males infertile, 1 in 4 women infertile, we're looking at the end of a species with the current trajectory we're on. And so current estimates are that we may have 60 to 80 years left as a species in a reproductive state, and then we diminish from there. So really stunning and startling fact that we've arrived at this point where we have the science and the data collection and the cognitive intellectual capacity to be witness to our own extinction. And not only that, be able to track it right back to the exact chemicals and exact toxins and exact separations from nature that we engineered to allow for this extinction event to happen between 1950 and today. So a stunning 50-year history, 70-year history that unfolds in the context of a 200,000-year-old species, and so Homo sapiens sapiens, which we named ourselves witwise twice with the word sapiens. I don't know why we did that, but I know that scientifically we felt like we were a slight diversion from the original Homo sapien. We were slightly different skull structure, something like that. But it's just interesting that it ended up being, hung on the word wise twice. So Homo sapiens sapiens, the full name of our species. And, there's not any evidence so far that we're terribly wise. So I think the point where we're in, to answer your question, is we are at a tipping point, and either we choose to be something we've never been before, or we continue the path into extinction. And as a hospice doctor, I can tell you that's not necessarily a bad thing. I see some of the most extraordinary transformations, the most extraordinary real life moments happen at the bedside of my patients that are dying, and they come into some of the most beautiful retrospective experiences of their life and realize that everything had been in its place, and what they thought was chronic failure was actually the universe unfolding in their lives in very specific ways to achieve things that they didn't even recognize in the prospective state. And so it's exciting to think that regardless of extinction or complete transformation, we're about to come to a point as a species where we suddenly see ourselves differently, and we either realize the beauty of our errors, and I think those are not mutually exclusive. I think the mistakes and failures that are made along a path are the journey, and the journey is ultimately beautiful. And I think a lot of us would say that in retrospect, it's the traumas, it's the broken relationships, it's these pivot points in life that are brought about by cataclysmic events end up being the things that shape us and putting us on the correct path. And so we don't know what the correct path for Homo sapiens is, but perhaps the correct path is our souls are on a journey to realize some enlightened state, some sort of connectivity outside of the human experience. And it needed this human experience to be in a finite moment to move something karmically or energetically in the universe that we can't see. It's too big of a chessboard for us to comprehend on this small 3-dimensional plane that we live on here. And so it's possible that everything is right, even if extinction is the end point, but we're going to get to see that. And so I feel really honored to be witness to this pivot point. And I expect in my lifetime, if I'm graced with more decades of life, I'll get to be witness to this great awakening that will happen in our death or in our complete transformation.
Very, very well said. Thank you for that. Because I think over the last several weeks, 8 weeks, I took off all this time to be with my son and welcome him into the world. And even leading up to having him, my wife and I talked a lot about what are we bringing a child into, and do we actually want to do that? And I feel like a lot of people have that question today, like, should I even have a child? And what am I bringing them into? But I think over the last 8 weeks, I took time and space off, and I really dove into a lot of content. And I think the stark, sort of alarming thing that I was left with was how many really intelligent people are saying some iteration of what you're saying. And that was really alarming for me when I heard, and it's all different vantage points and sort of different versions of this, but people sort of saying like, we're in a pretty dire situation. And I think you have such a unique perspective, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you on the show, to be able to talk about that inflection point that maybe happened back in the 40s, 50s, and what actually, in your perspective and your education, led to some of what we're seeing today, and the breakdown, the rise of autism, the decrease in testosterone and sperm counts, and the rise in different types of cancers. And I think you talked about men having a spike in Parkinson's disease and women having a spike in Alzheimer's. And so I would love to gain a little bit more insight from your view and your vantage point. What do you think has been one of the major contributing factors to the sort of genetic biological decline that we seem to be facing in this impending inflection point that we're heading towards?
Yeah, so in the 1940s, coming out of World War II, we had a repurposing of fossil fuels, which was kind of a second time this had happened within that century. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the great wealth that had occurred in Western civilization was around the group that had been called the robber barons. These were the railroads and the fossil fuel guys. And so this was oil and gas and the train industry that created the most mega wealth that had ever been occurred in the world. We were starting to see, single families having more wealth than, empires previously had. And so the Rockefellers, and then by the mid-century, the Rothschilds, and these massive, economic forces that were brewing in these few families. My grandfather worked with Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House and watched, the New Deal come through for the rebuilding of the country out of the Dust Bowl. And, so there's my grandfather, one generation back, driving through the countryside of West Virginia with Eleanor Roosevelt actually driving the Model T. He's, sitting next to her, and she would drive herself all over to these soup kitchens and, soup lines because America was starving. And so it's inconceivable to anybody living in an urban environment with any affluence right now that our country was starving so recently. Even more inconceivable is we are again. 1 in 4 children, 1 in 6 children, somewhere in that range in Kansas right now is going to sleep hungry every night. That is the worst hunger event we've had in the United States since the Dust Bowl. Is currently happening in the breadbasket of America. And we've been told that we are growing food for the world when in fact we're not. And we're actually not even growing food for ourselves anymore. We've become highly dependent on very long supply chains for real food. And what we're growing in Kansas, which is our most agriculturally rich state, 95% of Kansas is under agricultural use, but they're not growing food. They have to import 95% of their food. They're growing commodities for primarily fossil fuel additives. And so the ethanol that goes into our fuel is the primary driver of the growth in crop production that we've seen over the last 40 years. We haven't actually increased the amount of food production in the Midwest at all. We've only increased, fossil fuel and small increases in the vast amount of commodities that we make for beef, pork, sheep, poultry industries, all of this. And so amazingly, we're that recent, to a crisis of complete starvation, Dust Bowl. We've killed the soil from overtilling. And instead of, learning from that, at the end of World War II, we realized we could cheat. And instead of taking care of the soil and doing crop rotation and composting and good carbon management, we instead discovered if we took fossil fuels that we now had an abundance of because the war machine had ground down, and we suddenly have all this glut of oil, we were able to translate that into NPK fertilizers. And with those fossil fuel fertilizers pouring onto crops, it immediately created green plants. But what was, obviously missing from that was a lot of micronutrients and any soil intelligence. And so we were missing the fungi, the bacteria, the microbiome that we now realize in the last 20 years of science revolution that is the whole foundation for life itself. Like, you can't be a mammal, let alone a human, without this rich micro ecosystem that begins in our soil system, translates into our food, which then reinforces and inspires a complex microbiome within our gut that then feeds us. And so we started this real erosion, 100 years ago, late 1800s, and then it really accelerated when we became lazy with the green revolution that happened in the 1940s and 50s, pouring all this NPK fertilizer into the ground. What immediately resulted from that was really weakened plants for the first time. So we started growing a lot of monocrop. We were growing tons of wheat and corn and less soybean at the time, but a lot of wheat and corn. And what was happening is the plants were getting more and more prone to invasive weeds and insects. And so the chemical company that had really started with Rockefellers, right? And so Rockefeller had put together the 1910 Flexner Report. So he hired Dr. Flexner and his team, one of the big universities, in 1910 to write the Flexner Report, which basically was a propaganda piece to discredit herbalism, homeopathy, any naturally occurring medicine, osteopathy, all these natural medicine and medical practices that were really thriving at the time. The Flexner Report was built to damn all of those because Rockefeller had discovered that for all of the wealth he had accumulated in oil and gas, it was a fraction of what he could earn if he turned that oil into chemicals. And so the whole beginning of the pharmaceutical revolution was that we could take fossil fuel, compounds and convert them ultimately to drugs. And then instead of selling a gallon of gas for a quarter or something, or 10 cents at the time or whatever it was, they could sell it for many dollars, hundreds of dollars of that same gallon of gas could go into, if it was chemically modified, into drugs. So that's the beginning of the mega wealth of the West starting to repurpose itself into the pharmaceutical industry. And we saw that switch with the Flexner Report. That's the moment the AMA was born, the American Medical Association, which would become kind of the strong arm, kind of the mafia of medicine, and would, damn anything that came out that was in conflict with the message that we need more technology and we need more drugs to solve the problem of diseases. So that really got reinforced in the American mind, I think, with the antibiotic revolution that happened during World War II, as we discovered penicillin, which of course is a natural substance produced by fungi, because of course fungi know how to keep bacteria in check. But instead of telling the story of, oh my gosh, it's so exciting, the microbiome knows how to keep itself regulated, we had said, oh, look, we can kill the microbiome. And so germ theory that had come out of, a long debate with Louis Pasteur and in the French, academia, he was arguing with another guy named Belchamp. And Belchamp was really recognizing through exquisite research, observational research in twins and everything else, that disease penetrance, and specifically infectious diseases at the time, things like tuberculosis, cholera, and the like, did not show up the same despite identical genetics. And so he was starting to make observations that germs don't kill people. It's some change in the terrain of the body that leads to the prevalence of an infection or a disease or some. So he was the first one to really start to understand that we have an innate immune system, and that immune system is the result of a complex ecosystem that included the environment around us. So he was observing that the food environment that you put people in, the air pollution that you put them in, would correlate with disease propensity rather than genetics. And of course, the word genes and the word bacteria didn't even really exist at the time. But they had a version of the concept of microbes at the time, and they had a version of the concept of inherited traits that would ultimately become DNA and genes by the 1950s. So we were in the midst of this war between the idea of terrain and germ theory that raged into the early 1900s, and then Flexner Report. All right, germs are real. Germs are what's killing us. We need more technology to kill germs. We need to rev this up. We need to sterilize everything. And so, good idea to sterilize your surgical instruments if you're working on somebody with a gangrenous limb before going to the next patient. But to then extrapolate that to we should sterilize humans was the mistake we made. And so that's really where we began the erosion of life on Earth, was our combat against the microbiome. And we certainly did it at a grand scale with our agriculture as we developed more and more mechanized agriculture in the late 1800s, early decades of the 20th century. But then when we developed the chemical compounds from fossil fuels that would ultimately be the largest antibiotic reservoir in the world, we would really decimate life on the planet. And so that started in the 1970s in earnest with the debut of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the Roundup that you mentioned earlier. And glyphosate is a very potent antibiotic. It kills bacteria, fungi. The way in which it kills bacteria and plants is by blocking an enzyme pathway that produces some of the critical amino acids that account for like 30% of the plant volume. And so you lose all this protein synthesis by blocking this shikimate pathway, an enzyme pathway in the cells. And when you block that, you lose the building blocks for proteins. And the essential amino acids are only 9. And with glyphosate, you lose 3 of the 9. So you've lost 30% of the critical building blocks that you can't produce in your body for the 280,000 proteins that you need to build out of those simple amino acid building blocks. So kind of like a Lego set, you've got 22 different Legos that build the 280,000 proteins. And you've certainly played with Legos long enough to know that you can invent almost an infinite number of buildings out of your 22 shapes and sizes and colors. And in the same way as maybe the alphabet, making hundreds of thousands of words, the vowels are the most critical. And so your vowels, those 5 vowels in the English language, you start deleting those, you misspell every word, and that's what happens when you delete these 9 essential amino acids. You're not just missing 3 of the 22, you're missing 3 of the vowels, And so you start misspelling proteins throughout the human body. And when you misspell a protein, you lose function. And it's not necessarily zero function, but it's compromised function. And so now, as we start to have children in an environment where our food system is steeped in this chemical glyphosate, we currently pour 4.5 billion pounds of this chemical into our soil systems, water systems worldwide every year. 4.5 billion pounds of a chemical that ties up the critical nutrients, acts as a chelator as well. So it chelates minerals out of the soil and then blocks the enzyme pathway to make the essential amino acids. We're literally robbing our food system and therefore our bloodstream of the nutrients that would build life. And therefore we see, chronic disease in our children go from, 2 to 4% in the 1960s and 70s to 52, 54%, not just in the US, but Europe as well. Germany is currently reporting 54% of their children with a chronic disorder or disease. So it's an extraordinary journey into this, pressure cooker of can biology survive the constant deletion of its building blocks?
Jeez. Whew. Okay, I feel like I have to breathe after that one because it's like, I feel like what you just laid out is a pretty clear pathway in many ways. And I think where it led us was, and I'm going to just ask a few questions because, first off, I'm pretty layman's in this area. I'm not super proficient, but I can hear some of my listeners asking questions like, touch on the microbiome again. Like I've heard that word a lot, and like, what is it and why is it so important? And then I would love for you to just talk a little bit about glyphosate, because kind of what I heard was glyphosate, when injected into onto the plants and into the soils, not only robs the soils of certain nutrients that are required, but it actually has an impact on the capacity to have the proteins within our body, within that specific acids in our body produced properly. And so I would love for you to, one, talk about the microbiome just a little bit more and the importance of it within the ecosystem of the body. And then two, just touch again on glyphosate and its impact within our system and some of the things that correlate with that.
Yeah. So the microbiome is, a fascinating new universe, literally. And so we, up until the 1960s, I would say, just saw bacteria as the bad guy. They were the germs that were causing pneumonia or sinusitis or whatever ailment we saw, tuberculosis. And the microbiome is little bacteria. They're the most famous of them. The bacteria are about 30,000 species that we've managed to kind of demonstrate within the human environment, the human organ systems. And we used to think that the skin and maybe the colon were the places where bacteria, persisted. But we now know that there's actually bacteria within every organ system of the body. We have these tiny little bacterium that live inside the brain and cerebral spinal fluid, So the healthy human body we're starting to have to come to terms with is not some sterile place that is run by some, marauding immune system that just kills everything that's not human. That was definitely the model that was handed to me in 1990 as a doctor, but that's not the case. We now know that the immune system is actually not even human in itself. The immune system is literally a dance between the microbes and the singular cellular organisms and the multicellular organisms. And those multicellular organisms within us are not even limited to the human cells. Like we have 70 trillion human cells, but that's grossly outnumbered by the bacteria themselves. So we have somewhere around 1.4 quadrillion bacteria in a human body now. But that's dwarfed by the tiny little bacterium that live inside each human cell. Each human cell would be unable to survive. In fact, any mammalian or multicellular organism would be unable to survive without these tiny little bacterium that are the result of archaea, which were the very first bacteria that showed up on the planet some 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. The archaea showed up, and they could survive in volcanoes and sulfur acid baths and like the origin of Earth kind of toxicity. These archaea were extremely resilient, and they were fermenters. They could ferment energy out of slow digestion of carbohydrates and the things around them. And so these archaea became really good at swapping genetic information. So they did something called horizontal gene transfer, where if they found a new gain of function or a new niche or opportunity or a new gene that worked, they would swap it immediately with all of the surrounding bacterium. And so they got really good at exchanging information, and the result was biodiversification. And so that new gene in a new environment would lead to a new function, which would lead to a new species of bacterium. So over billions of years, this gene transfer between single-celled organisms exploded. And then about 3 billion years ago, maybe as far back as 3.5 billion years ago, we suddenly got viruses. And the viruses are not part of the microbiome. The microbiome is really living organisms, is the word micro and biome, small living organisms. And to be a living organism, you need to be able to create your own fuel, and you need to be able to reproduce. And the viruses can do neither. They cannot reproduce themselves, and they can produce no energy. They have no machinery within them that demand energy. They're just packets of genetic information. And so the breakthrough of the virus was that bacterium found out that if they instead of just abutting another bacterium to do horizontal gene transfer where they could swap things in the neighborhood, they found out or whether they were conscious of the experience or not, the biologic opportunity for adaptation and biodiversification favored the result of viruses, which was if you wrap that piece of genetic update, that new gene, gain of function in a protein packet that we would call an envelope, and send that far and wide, you could go not just next door, you could get it, across the world. And so this was the origin of bacterium starting to be able to spread far. And so now we can do very rapid biodiversification on the planet because you no longer had to wait for hundreds of millions of years for bacterium to slowly move genetic information around the planet. Viruses were an explosion of opportunity for planet Earth as we started to be able to exchange genetic information at high speeds. And so that was what led to the fungi. And the fungi are the second, major kingdom within the microbiome, and of course include things like yeast and all of this that we're familiar with in the health world, much of which we fear, right? We fear the fungal infections in our bone marrow transplant units. We fear yeast infections, whether it be a woman after antibiotics for her urinary tract infection, antibiotics, or a child with antibiotic exposure to food getting thrush, whatever it is. We fear these yeasts and everything else, which is amazing because they really have become the foundation of multicellular life. So without the fungi, we would have never made the leap from bacteria to earthworm. And so the fungi allowed for a completely different mechanism for digestion, where they, instead of trying to digest stuff within them like the bacterium did, they outsourced digestion to the external environment around them. And they just exude digestive nutrients, digestive enzymes out around them, and they turn the whole world into their stomach. And so now they're absorbing the nutrients that they are digesting outside of themselves. And so their digestive tract is literally the soils of the earth. And so it's a brilliant mechanism where the microbiome within soil becomes the workforce to do their extra work, and they exude stuff that attracts bacteria, and they have their external gut that's feeding them all the time. So far, the fungi are the most intelligent, most efficient workforce on the planet because they externalized very quickly their workforce. When the multicellular animals started to develop, we learned from the fungi that we can't do all of that work because a multicellular cell can't produce its own energy. And so it has to rely on bacteria. To do that internally, we absorb the archaea. And so the first single cell to multicellular organism leap occurred when two archaea, an archaea and a methane-producing mycobacterium, combined. And so at some point, an archaea swallowed a methane-producing bacterium, and it became a double-walled organism. And that would be the first mitochondrion. And that mitochondrion was a revolutionary leap in life on Earth, because it allowed us to switch from fermentation to oxygen-based revolution here. And I promise all of this minutia is worthwhile. Like it sounds like just a waste of time to put a crown all this in your head.
Not at all. Not at all.
Answer the question of why are we going extinct right now? And so the mitochondrion takes carbohydrates and fat in the form of fatty acids and breaks it down into the exact same molecule, which is acyl-CoA, in a single enzyme step through the first membrane. Through the second membrane, it turns it into acetyl-CoA. So you get fatty acids or carbohydrate, and you have all these nutrition people, of course, bitching about, oh, carbs are bad, no fat is bad, no fat is good, no carbs are good. They're exactly the same freaking molecule. Like as soon as they consumed by a mitochondria, you're the same. You're acyl-CoA. Acyl-CoA goes into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA goes to the respiratory loop, uses oxygen and hydrogen, which is basically extracted from water, which is the most abundant resource within the human body. And that water churns hydrogen and oxygen through the respiratory chain of the mitochondria, and we get ATP, adenosine triphosphate, at 10x the efficiency that fermentation did. So the ability to produce energy 10 times more effectively was the leap of life on Earth. And that's when we went really into an exciting explosion of diversification on the planet, from plant life. And multicellular plants came out of the fungi, which are more unicellular. And then from the plants, we got into enough carbon material to start to allow for the complex multicellular organisms to occur. And among those were the protozoa, which were the first multicellular organisms that really are single cells, but they have all of the features of a multicellular organism. And protozoa remain very important in our microbiome. And so we have a lot of protozoa. We have a lot of, and famous among these are the bad guys, like malaria is a protozoa. We always hear about how bad malaria is, but we're going to very soon find out that malaria protozoa, when in a healthy relationship to the greater microbiome, is very important for the health and immune system of people in Africa or the endemic areas of malaria throughout the tropics, etc. And so it's a very new world where what we used to think was just all bad, we're starting to find it out it's the reverse. It's literally the building blocks of life at every step. And so that's kind of the microbiome: bacteria, fungi, protozoa. If you want to clump those in there, you can. They're single cell, even though they're more like human cells. But then the leap to your second part of the question, which was how does glyphosate affect the human body? The first 10 ways that it affects the human body is by killing everything I just told you about. So the very first things that it starts to undermine are the bacterium within the soil that are doing both the genetic database that are producing all of the genomic complexity on the planet. The microbiome, you're at like 2 billion genes that have been discovered in just the bacterium so far. And the fungi, we're now at an estimate of somewhere around maybe 125 trillion different genes in the world kingdom of the fungi. Humans, as a Homo sapien, I have 20,000 genes. So you compare my 20,000 to the 2 billion or 2 million of the bacterium within me, or the 125 trillion. These numbers are so grotesquely huge that it's obvious that the intelligence of the way in which we adapt and change is coming from the viruses. And most of those viruses are being born from the bacterium. And when we know that a virus is coming straight from, or a genetic piece of information coming straight from a bacterium, we often call them bacteriophage. So you might hear that term bacteriophage. That's the same thing as a virus. It just happens to have origin directly from a bacteria. But if you look back in history, you realize everything came from a bacteria. All genetic information was churned out of that life within the soil and ultimately the ocean and beyond. And so we have this massive, ecosystem of bacteria in the air, the oceans, the water systems, the soils, and this is the genomic intelligence of biodiversification and adaptation on the planet. Keep in mind, viruses, not living organisms, not part of the microbiome. They don't respond to antibiotics the same way, blah, blah, blah. And so to clump those into the same thing of like germs is inaccurate. A virus is not a germ. A virus is a genetic packet of information that's been sent by either another species or your own species. And so as soon as you see something go pandemic for humans, we're producing all of that. That's one human sending an important genetic information packet to another human. And we wouldn't do that, but for a very careful rationale. The decision to make viral proteins and repeat the structure of a virus and send that out is one of the most regulated steps in human and otherwise biology. It takes 280 different proteins to be present in the correct correlation and concoction or symphony of genetic controls to decide to make that protein ribosome go and translate that RNA or DNA into a protein. And so all these textbooks and all these animations you see going around, like COVID-19 comes in and binds your cell and takes over the genomic apparatus and makes tons of COVID, and then you turn into this infectious machine. That's that's 40-year-old science. 40-year-old science is the same science that basically said that there's no such thing as depression, right? Like this is archaic information that viruses somehow take over our cells. They don't at all. They move genetic information in and out of my cells every day at an extreme rate. Currently, if you did PCR across the entire viral spectrum on my blood right now, I would be expressing somewhere around 10 to the 8th to 10 to 15 viruses in my bloodstream right now. Your child, how old's your baby? A month old?
8 weeks, like 2 months.
8 weeks old. So your baby, when your baby hit, what's his name? I feel funny calling him a baby.
So it's okay. His name is Code.
So Code, when he was 7 days old, so Code even right now can't make antibodies. It's going to be another 4 or 6 months before he knows how to really complete an antibody response, which is a complex cellular kind of adaptation downstream. At 1 week of age, Code had 10 to the 8th viruses in every gram of stool that he produced. And I'm betting that you guys witnessed a fair amount of grams of stool. So there was a lot of diaper changing going on in those couple of months as the milk dragon got going. And so what he was doing is taking in an enormous amount of genetic information from the microbiome of his gut that was brand new, right? Because he didn't have a microbiome until the moment he went through mom's vaginal canal. Vaginal delivery, maybe TMI, but C-section.
C-section, yeah.
C-section. So he didn't get through vaginal canal, but he got it the moment he suckled on mom's breast. So the moment he suckled on mom's breast, he started to adopt the bacterium from her skin. And so he'll have some challenges in that he's going to have to develop enteric bacterium, and that's going to be a slower process because of C-section. But he can get there. He'll fight through that. And ways in which you could help him do that is get him around as many pets as possible, especially dogs. Dogs have a very similar gut microbiome to humans, and they lick their butt all the time. And so they're the best fecal transplant device we have found so far, the dog in the house. And so get yourself a dog and put that around the kid, because the C-section was there wasn't much organic garden for him to dig into initially. But suffice to say, the air he is breathing, everything he's touching is exuding this genetic information that we call viruses. And his whole gut is full, 10 to the 8th, 10 billion viruses in that first week. And he has no antibodies to fight viruses, because it turns out viruses are not fought by antibodies at all. So this whole current science that you're being told that you need a vaccine to produce an antibody spike protein to protect you from a virus, that's not the biology of viruses that we know since 2010. Ironically, we gave the Nobel Prize of Chemistry to Dr. Dwadna and her partner, who discovered Cas9, which is an enzyme that sits inside of the human cell and determines which virus you're going to transcribe or which protein you're going to make. And it is the database that remembers which viruses have been there and what you've done with them, what you allowed to translate and everything else. And in my recent presentation, if you want 3 hours on genetic engineering, which is a pretty interesting dive into how insane we are to go from corn all the way to our current, genetic modification through vaccine programs, you need that 3-hour dive. I think, as a consumer, to not know that information is to ignore the bullet that's coming at us. So
and where is that? Where can people
dive there? I give I take I've got the clip where she's on a TED Talk and she talks about her discovery of Cas9 in 2016. And what she says is that Cas9 is literally the equivalent of the body's highest intelligence of a vaccine passport. That's fascinating that she was allowed to say that in 2016. If she had come out and said that in 2020, her Instagram account would have been taken down, would have been shut down. And so just 4 years ago, you've got the Nobel Prize winner for discovering Cas9 talking about how the body has the intelligence of vaccination within it, And it doesn't have anything to do with antibodies. It has to do with this protein synthesis decision at Cas9. Well, interestingly, the reason she's winning the chemistry Nobel Prize is not because she developed, the science that would discover Cas9 and would be the great discovery that the human immune system is in this extraordinary balance with all the viruses. Instead, Cas9 would become the primary mechanism for CRISPR, which is our current mechanism to genetically engineer humans and crops. And so we took what was the most important discovery in the immune system and we co-opted it as a technology to start genetically modifying ourselves against the very microbiome that Cas9 worked with to create the intelligence of the human genome. And when I say that, I'm quite literal. That Cas9 and our mechanisms of expression of the viral genome built the human genome. We know that over 50% of my 20,000 human genes that I got from mom and dad were inserted into the human germline. Into the germline is a description of the DNA we pass on through sperm and ovum, got inserted into the human germline or into the human sperm and ovum history by viruses. And so without that viral insertion, we wouldn't have had half of our genome. The other 40% that we've been able to track outside of the human experience is through horizontal gene transfer from the bacteria in our guts and immune systems and environment. And so either by horizontal gene transfer, just like the archaea and the bacterium used to do it, 4 billion years ago, or by direct viral influence and spread of this genetic information, we became mammals and we ultimately became humans. And these were critical updates. You can't have a placenta that works to allow for live birth without a single viral update that happened a few billion years ago, or a few 100 million years ago, that allowed for the dawn of live birth and moving away from reptiles and all that into the mammals. And so that shift from mammal to bird, from reptile to bird to mammal was allowed by viral gain of function. And so another example is the one that allows sperm to dump its mitochondrion before it fertilizes the human egg. Without that, we would have no functional passage of genetic information from mom to baby. And so these critical updates that were direct insertions of viruses that allowed us to make these leaps in biology. So there was not like a bird that slowly became a human. It was suddenly a genetic update from a virus was put into a germline, and suddenly a placenta could develop instead of an egg. And so that was the kind of these paradigm leaps that we see that must have happened in the fossil record, because we don't see any evidence of evolution in the fossil record. We see these bizarre paradigm leaping, jumps from one species to another over time. And so those were definitely moments of high viral transfaction, viral intelligence accelerating within the life on the earth. Interestingly, the things that induce those high rapid rates of intelligence are extinction level threats. And so when biology is threatened, it needs to make more adaptation. If things are well and you got plenty of food and everything else, you just keep reproducing yourself. There's no reason to change. Adversity creates change. And this is really important if you're going through the mental health stories like you've done, Connor, and talked about in Mental Health Month. I really appreciate your insights into that. As men, as women, as humans, we are prone to this collapse of identity that we'll come back to in a minute and stuff like that as to a glyphosate answer. But at the foundation, I want us to be realizing that we became who we are because of this drive for life. And when you find yourself depressed, it's because you've lost your drive for life. You've become separated from this sense of forward momentum. And the soul cannot tolerate that. And this is the danger, and ultimate punishment that we have found with something like the extraordinary punishment that we give people when we do something like solitary confinement. Solitary confinement, within 2 or 3 days, you've got somebody who was totally sane a moment ago, is now seeing voices, seeing people, hearing voices, seeing people, is psychotic within those 3 days because they have no input, no forward motion. And so that loneliness that happens when you lose momentum is profound. And interestingly, biology seems to deal with adversity and its need for an adaptation from that adversity better than it does the stagnancy. And so biology plays that out, that adversity has created the abundance of life, the adversity, the adaptation of life, and the biodiversity that we see within it. So we're in the midst of the 6th great extinction, which means that we may actually spawn the next highest intelligence leap in the next millions of years, after we go extinct, due to the level of extinction stress we put on the earth. And so is that maybe our bizarre contribution? Did we show up to induce the sixth great extinction so that life could once more be completely transformed after us? It's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, I mean, so two things. Many things after listening to that. Thank you for all of that incredible information, and just the way that you position it, I think is, excuse me, is very it's poignant, and I think it makes the point as well. One, are you sure you don't have another hour? I'm like, shit, man, what do I do to get you to just stay here with me for an hour and have more conversation? But two, it reminds me of this sentiment that Terence McKenna had, where he talks about, maybe the Earth has its own intelligence, and that, part of what the Earth is doing is that he talked about this push for us to become interplanetary species, and for us to, that we are facing this extinction event, and that we are even, this is decades ago, he was talking about us facing an extinction event. And he said, maybe we need to consider that the proverbial soil that we came from knows something that we don't, and that we need to trace our lineage back to it, and we need to listen. And the other voice that I heard was Dr. Wade Davis, who's an anthropologist in British Columbia and Vancouver, and he talks about how we do ourselves a disservice as a species by not knowing biology. That the basic principles of what makes us is unknown by like 99.99% of people. And I think that's part of why I wanted to have you on the show, is that, the more I've dug into your stuff, the more it's like, well, how the hell did I not know so much of this information about just simple things about how I operate? Because a lot of the stuff that you talk about, is needed, I think, in many ways. And the fact that we are continuing to use these pesticides and use these chemicals on our crops that are killing our soil. I think I heard you say that we have something like 60 harvests left before most of our soil in North America is completely barren and unable to really produce anything anymore.
Unfortunately, that's global. We have 60 harvests left on Earth.
Jesus. All right. So I think we only have like a few minutes left. And I want to honor your time and get a solid commitment that you'll come back on the show. Can I get a verbal yes? This is my sales tactic right here.
That's right. Lots of witnesses. I'm happy to come back with you guys for sure. And I think one way to conclude on
please
your thoughts there are coming back to your question of how does glyphosate directly affect humanity? Because I mentioned that the first thing it does is poisons mitochondrion, kills bacterium, kills the nutrients in our food, all of this stuff. But our laboratory, I started my own basic science lab back in 2012 after I left UVA. I used to develop chemotherapy. I was very much inside the box pharmaceutical guy. But as I started to discover nutrition through my chemotherapy, I was developing compounds of chemo through vitamin A compounds. And in that journey, I realized that not a single case of cancer had ever been caused by a lack of chemotherapy. And in the same way, not a single heart attack had ever happened from a lack of statin drugs,
Yeah.
So really the reason disease happens came to me as a pharmaceutical guy, like, oh my God, it's all environmental. It's all got to do with the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. If it's not that, then it's nothing. And there would be no such thing as chronic disease if we had contact with clean water, air, soil systems, and food that would come from them. And so that's the journey that I've been on. And interestingly, as we ask that deeper question of why are we in an existential crisis? Because not only are we in an extinction crisis, we're in a cognitive, spiritual, psychosocial crisis. Why that? And bizarrely, that gets us to the answer of how does glyphosate directly affect the human body? And so our lab over the last 8 years has been studying the effects of Roundup and glyphosate directly on the gut, as well as the blood, brain, and the kidney tubules of the body. And all of those systems of barriers, so the gut barrier between your microbiome out there and all of the nutrients and all that, and your immune system that sits in the 1 millimeter deep to your gut and sinonasal cavity, that entire two tennis courts and surface area is responding to an overwhelming amount of input now, because Roundup destroys the tight junctions, the Velcro that holds those billions of cells together that make an intact gut membrane, sinonasal membrane. And so now we have environmental seasonal allergies. We're sensitive to pollens we've never been sensitive to before. We can't breathe the air we were billions of years developed within. And in the same way, suddenly in the last 2 decades, we're allergic to everything. We're allergic to avocados and nuts and seeds. And when I was going through school, I had one kid in the school that was allergic to peanuts. There was one EpiPen in the nurse's station. Now you go into an elementary school and it's like EpiPen Central with everybody's names on it and what they're allergic to. And it's the most bizarre thing. This one's allergic to squash. What the hell? Well, we genetically modified squash in the 1990s so that it could be sprayed directly with glyphosate. So what happens when you tear apart the Velcro between the cells of your gut is you develop leaky gut. Unfortunately, we've showed in the lab that as soon as the leaky gut injury happens, you open up the blood-brain barrier. So you get leaky gut and leaky brain, which now means the whole neurologic system, peripheral nerves, central nerves, are overwhelmed in their immune function as well. And so your whole body is in this chronic inflammatory state back. As you take glyphosate for higher and higher quantities in the gut, you also, in that antimicrobial antibiotic effect, you lose the bacterium that are necessary to touch the enteric endocrine cells that make the serotonin for our brain. 90% of the serotonin made in our body is made in the gut lining, and it can't be made if the bacterium that are a specific species of bacteria aren't hanging on to the enteric endocrine cell. And so you have this incredible synergy between microbial life and the human brain that disappears. And so between the dissolving of our barriers between the outside world and our human organism, we lose our biologic self-identity. And in the same moment, we lose the neurotransmitters that would give us the cognitive and intellectual capacity to see that same self-identity. And so if we did anything with Roundup, if we did anything with glyphosate as a molecule, we destroyed human self-identity. And this is where we struggle today as men, as women. We are losing our cellular sense of identity. The result is massive amounts of autoimmune disease, massive amounts of chronic inflammation and chronic disease as our bodies start to fight everything. We have lost our identity and put ourselves into opposition with all of the nature that actually birthed humanity through this single chemical glyphosate in our food system. So if we were going to do anything, we would outlaw glyphosate today. And fortunately, with our work for our nonprofit, you can go to Farmers Footprint, and our bigger project is projectbiome.org. But Farmers Footprint has been helping revolutionize the understanding and awareness of the need to switch to regenerative agriculture and food systems to immediately halt this poisoning of not only our food system, but poisoning of the human self-identity.
Whew. All right. Well, we're going to have those in the show notes so that people can check them all out and check out the information. Again, I want to honor your time because we're pretty much up here, even though I have a few, I would love to have a few more questions for you, but thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for your work, for your voice, for just sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. And I think it certainly needs to be out there. And so any final words of where you would like people to go and check out your work or some of the causes, or do you list them there?
Sure, yeah. Zach Bush MD is the other site for you, in addition to farmersfootprint.us or projectbiome.org. But zachbushmd.com is my educational website. It's worth going to. I've got a bunch of topics from pregnancy to mental health and beyond. But I would encourage you to go to the knowledge page there and dive deep on the Global Health Education Initiative. So a year ago, at the beginning of this pandemic narrative that we've been living under, I saw the need for really radical education to happen, and it needed to be free and not behind paywalls and everything else. And so we created a free system that's been supported by the global community. We've got over 1,200 unique donors now that have just given $10, $25 to keep the momentum going on this project. And I've got a couple of the brilliant physicians and scientists behind me have helped out. And we've got incredible physician panels on the innate immune system. I did an hour and 30-minute deep dive on the virome. If you want a lot more information on viruses than you heard today, that's just a fascinating journey. More detail there to get the refresher there and a deeper dive. And then importantly, I did a 3-hour topic a month and a half ago, which was called What Happened Last Year. And it takes you through all the public health statistics of globally what happened over the last 20 years, and to take into account the last 20 years of trajectory of disease, specifically respiratory death, and then what happened last year and how it fit in, and to realize that we were told a very myopic picture of data which did not tell the whole story of what's been going on as we march into this great extinction event. And this year was not an anomaly. This year was exactly in line with all of the previous years. And so we did not have a shift. We certainly had a pandemic, but we have pandemics every year. Literally, we've had, I think it's around 12,800 viruses have been tracked pandemically since 1976. So 12,800 pandemics since 1976. One more is hardly news, and yet we made it central to our entire philosophy of the way in which we are opposed to nature and how it's attacking us. And that narrative is certainly furthering us down the path of destruction. And we need to realize that these viruses are literally not only a cry for help from biology, but also our pathway back towards an intelligent relationship to nature itself. So what happened last year is their 3-hour deep dive. And then I just finished GMO, the GMO topic, which is, I think it's titled GMO, Engineering Nature Out of Humanity. And it takes you on a 30-year dive on the mechanisms and technology of genetic engineering and how the current vaccine industry has become, the penultimate genetic engineering effort with Cas9 usurpation and all of this stuff with CRISPR. So a lot of exciting, look of science there. Wow, we are brilliant scientists. To be able to do what we do today compared to what we were capable of in the 1990s is an extraordinary leap in technology. And it's further fascinating or further amazing than the cell phone, But all of that technology is clearly taking us in the wrong path. So do the deep dive there. I've got over a dozen hours of content for you to learn from on the global health education stuff, and it is stuff that you will want your children and grandchildren to know. And we need to do that. We need to change the education system. We need to re-educate our children to see themselves as part of this beautiful world that we were born within and not in opposition to it. And so I think we have a hopeful and healthy future if those children will be allowed to change direction. And to do that, as parents, as a society, we're going to have to make space for that. And we're going to have to remove the military medical complex from the influence on our children and let them think freely and think clearly. And to do that, they're going to have the clarity of the microbiome within them, which means we need to get them out in nature. So get your kids out this weekend, dive into the dirt, spend as much time in the forest, the woods, the ocean as you can, find the most wild environments and rewild those kids. Because if we don't rewild humanity, we're going to disappear quick.
So well said. And what a great place to end off our conversation here today. So thank you so much for being on the show. For everyone that's out there, you can check out the show notes for all the links to go check out Zach Bush's work. And as always, don't forget to man it forward. Share this podcast with somebody that you know will be interested in this conversation, that would like to dive in. Share your thoughts and your comments on the video and wherever you're watching this. And don't forget to rate and subscribe. And until next week, this is Connor Beaton signing off.